Good evening. We are learning Parshat Mishpatim. We are on page 417. Parshat Mishpatim comes right after Parshat Yitro, and in Parshat Yitro we received the Torah, and Parshat Mishpatim already gives us the first installment of 54 commandments. So the majority of these commandments are between a man and his fellow, interpersonal relations. First section is about Jewish slaves. Chapter 21. These are the ordinances that you shall place before them. If you buy a Jewish slave, and there are two circumstances under which a Jew can become a slave. One is if he is poor and he cannot support himself, so he has an option to sell himself as a slave, and the purchase money he can save for future. When he becomes free, he can start a business with it, and he works for 6 years, and the master has to support his family as well. So both the man and his family receive shelter and food for 6 years. The family are free, but they live on the property of the master, and the man works. And the second case is if a person steals. If he was caught as a thief, he must return the lost object or the money. Sometimes he has to pay double. But what if he already used up the money, or he sold the item and he used the money? He cannot pay back, and he is poor, he doesn't have money. So then the court sells him as a slave, as a servant, and the money from the purchase they give to the victim to compensate him for the lost object. So the Torah tells us that a Jewish slave shall work for 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go free for no charge. And it gives us some additional laws. If he is not married yet, if he shall arrive by himself, he shall leave by himself. Then he leaves alone. But if he is the husband of a woman, which means if he came with his family, then his wife shall leave with him. When he goes out free, his wife goes out with him. From here we learn that until that time the wife and the children are supported by the master. And in verse 4 tells us that also if he comes with his wife already, his master has the option of giving him a non-Jewish maidservant, a non-Jewish slave woman, to mate with and to produce children for the master who are going to be slaves. Verse 4 says, if his master will give him a woman and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall belong to her master, and he shall go out by himself. Now, we're on page 419. We have to keep in mind that the Torah concept of slavery is not what we are familiar with from the African slaves, from the unfortunate, harsh conditions that they had to undergo on plantations in North and South Americas and in Asia. The cruel treatment and the beatings and the killings that they had to go through. The Torah concept of a slave is a worker who is committed to work for a certain amount of time. That is, for Jewish slave, a worker who committed himself to work for 6 full years. And therefore, a Jewish worker should not sign any contracts that obligate him for a set time period, because that would put him in the category of a slave, because the Jewish people are considered servants of God, and therefore they should not be servants of men. And as such, a Jew is allowed to stop work and leave his job whenever he wants. The reason why we go to work is to provide us with resources to live. And at any moment, if a Jew feels I have enough to feed myself and my family, and I don't need to spend time working anymore, I would rather start living, a Jewish worker can just quit at any moment he desires. He doesn't have to give advanced warning. He can leave in the middle of the day, or he can just call his boss and say, tomorrow I'm not coming in, and that's it. The boss cannot have any complaints against him, because when you hire a Jew, you know that you're hiring him only as long as he needs money. Once he got the money that he needed, he can quit. He is allowed to quit. However, a slave, what differentiates a slave from a regular worker is that a slave is obligated to work for 6 years. He cannot say, oh, that's it, I quit. He is committing to work for 6 years. And that's really it. Besides that, you must treat your slave with the same respect that you would treat any other worker. And we're going to learn some of the laws as we go through the Parsha, and you will see that the Torah treats every human being with dignity, even slaves. Even non-Jewish slaves are treated with tremendous respect that the plantations never saw. Now, that is why we find something very interesting on page 419 in verse 5. If the slaves shall say, I love my master, my wife and my children. My wife and my children means the non-Jewish slave woman that my master gave me and the children that were born from her. I shall not go free. I don't want to become free because I love it here too much. They feed me here, they shelter me here, they treat me with respect. I don't want to leave my slavery. Where did you hear such a thing, that a slave doesn't want to run away from his master? He wants to stay. The master says, go. And the slave says, can I please remain your slave a little longer? And that is exactly for the reason that we explained, that we treat a slave with the same respect that we treat any other human being. So again, for the slave, it doesn't matter if I am free or not. I go to work and I enjoy my life with my family afterwards. So the slave says, my life in the free world is too risky. I already came here because, for example, I was poor and I couldn't make ends meet, and I'm afraid of that. Can I please stay by you, my master, and I will continue enjoying the benefits? Or the slave might say, I remember when I was free, I had a big desire to steal and I couldn't control it, and I got into trouble because of it, and I'm afraid if I go out into the world, I might have that temptation again. Instead of working honestly, I might want to rob people. So please, I would rather be safe than sorry. let me stay as a slave and enjoy the comfort of your home. So is that permitted? And in verse 6, Torah tells us, then his master shall bring him to the court, and they shall bore a hole through his ear with a special instrument, a sharp, thick needle. They make a hole in his ear. So a piercing for a man is a sign of slavery. And he shall serve him forever. Forever, that in Torah means for 50 years. Up to 50 years, until the Jubilee year. After 7 cycles of 7 years, what we call Shemitah, which is 49 years, 7 times 7, we have the Jubilee year. The 50th year is called Yovel. And in Yovel, every slave, every Jewish slave must go free. Even though he is the one that asked for extension to stay as a slave longer, we allow it until the Jubilee year. Once Yovel comes, we force him out, because, okay, fine, you were a slave for 50 years, what about your children and your grandchildren that were born while you were a slave? We don't want your future generations to forget that they were once free. Let them go out, wait 1 year, and if you really want, sell yourself as a slave again after the Jubilee year. Jubilee year is also unique that all land that was sold in Israel, the ancestral, the original land that they received when they entered the land with Yeshua, if you sell such land, it's not really a sale, it is only a lease for up to 50 years. And in the Jubilee year, all land goes back to its original owners. So every family receives another chance. You might have been poor for the past 50 years, and you had to sell your land, and you had to sell yourself as slaves. But at the end of the 50-year cycle, we give you back your freedom, we give you back your land. And in another Torah portion, we learn that when a master sends his slave to freedom, he has to give him severance package. He has to give him a lot of gifts, money, food, cattle, clothing, everything that he needs to start his life again and to start his own business again. So the idea of slavery was for the benefit of the poor, for the benefit of the unfortunate. Instead of them being in the street begging, they had the option of honorably living by a wealthy family, being supported and working there for 6 years. And then they had the opportunity at the end of 6 years to try their free life again with all the gifts that the master gave them. Now, on page 419, verse 7, we read about another kind of a slave, and that is a slave girl. If a man will sell his daughter as a slave woman, how is that possible? Why would a man sell his daughter? And that is in a case when a family is poor again, and the father sees that he cannot provide for his children, unfortunately. And there is a possibility that they will end up on the street. So for the boys, they already from the age of 6 can get a job to help out, to carry some things, to watch sheep, and so on and so forth. And they can at least get enough money for food and shelter. However, for a girl, it's very dangerous. A young girl 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, she cannot get married yet, and nobody can provide for her. What is she supposed to do? If we allow her to go and get a job, people will take advantage, and she might end up becoming, chas v'shalom, a prostitute. We don't want that to happen. So we give permission to the father to find a nice Jewish family, preferably where the man already has a wife and children, and he has more resources and he wants to help out. And such a nice young Jewish man from a wealthy family comes to the father and says, I will provide for your daughter until she is ready to get married. She will be like a servant in my household, and then when she turns 12, either I will marry her as my second wife, or my son, who is growing up, maybe he will marry her. There's nothing embarrassing in marrying a former slave girl, because she comes from an honorable Jewish family, descendants of Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. Just the circumstances forced the father to give her up to become a servant for a few years, but she's still of pure blood, of very honorable descent. So this young man offers the father some money and commits that when the girl turns 12, either he or his son are going to marry her, and she will become a full-fledged wife. So the Torah says, if a man will sell his daughter as a slave woman, better to translate it as a servant, she shall not leave like the leave taking of the regular slaves, which means she will not go out just at the end of 6 years, but rather she will become free when she turns 12, which may be earlier than 6 years. As well as we're going to learn, there are some times that non-Jewish slaves go free, for example, if they're injured, and that doesn't apply to her. Now, verse 8, and when she becomes 12 years old, if she is displeasing in the eyes of her master, who designated her for himself, which means he wanted to marry her, or he wanted his son to marry her, but now that he sees how she works and he doesn't like her work and he doesn't want to marry her, he shall assist in her redemption. He has to set her free. He shall not have the power to sell her to a strange man, for he had betrayed her. He is not allowed to sell her as a slave to some other man, because it's considered a betrayal that he promised to marry her and now he's not marrying her. So, if a father sells his daughter as a servant, no one can sell her second time, not the master. And if she goes back to the father can no longer sell her second time. Verse 9, if he had designated her for his son, he shall deal with her according to the rights of the young women. She will become a full-fledged wife of him or his son. He cannot treat her any less than anyone else. And that's what verse 10 says. If he shall take another wife in addition to her, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her marital relations. Just because she is a former slave does not give the right to her husband to treat her any less than a regular wife. And from here, we also learn what are the obligations of the husband to his wife. The husband is obligated to provide his wife with food, with clothing, and with marital relations. Surprisingly, marital relations are not his right, but rather marital relations are the right of the woman to receive. and the man is the obligated party in this case. Now, we go to page 421. The next case is intentional murder. One who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death. The next verse is about unintentional murder. But for one who had not lain in ambush, and God had caused it to come to his hand, I shall provide you a place to which he shall flee. This is a brief introduction to laws that are going to be explained later, that someone who through an accident or without malicious intent killed another Jew, he is not put to death because it was unintentional, but he does need to go to a city of refuge and stay there until Kohen Gadol dies. This serves as a punishment for him for being not careful, as well as protection from the family of the deceased man, so that they shouldn't try to take revenge on him. Verse 14. If a man shall act intentionally against his fellow to murder him with guile, from my altar shall you take him to die. Even if he is a Kohen serving in Beit HaMikdash, we still escort him out and we conduct a court case, and if there are two witnesses, we kill him. We kill the murderer. Now verse 15, about hitting one's parents. One who strikes his father or mother shall surely be put to death. And here, this is applicable only if a man hits his father or mother and causes blood to come out or a bruise. With any other person, you just have to pay for the damages. The 5 damages that we're going to learn on the bottom of this page. However, if it's the father or the mother, there is death penalty for injuring them. Now, verse 16, about kidnapping. One who kidnaps a man and sells him or enslaves him shall surely be put to death. Kidnapping is considered very serious because taking freedom from a person against his will is like murdering him. You're taking away his life, his ability to decide. Therefore, if a man decides to sell himself as a slave, that is okay. But you cannot kidnap someone else. And therefore, we're very careful not to limit someone's freedom. Which means, as parents, we cannot forbid our adult children to do things that they think are right, just because we disagree with them. We have to be careful not to put emotional harm on a person that would limit them, because that would also be considered kidnapping. When you threaten or scare a child and leave him with that fear for the rest of his life, that will not allow him to do things that normal people do, that would be a partial kidnapping of his mind. Now, verse 17 speaks about cursing parents. One who curses his father or mother shall surely be put to death. Here we're speaking about cursing with the name of God. Verse 18, if one man damages another man. If men quarrel and one strikes his fellow and he doesn't die but becomes sick, if he gets up and goes about outside under his own power, the one who struck him is absolved from death. He doesn't need to die. Only for his lost time he shall pay, and he shall provide his healing. So the Torah tells us that for injury to a human being, you have to pay for lost time from work and doctor bills, and for medicine, for healing. Elsewhere, the Torah tells us that there are 3 more payments that damager must make, and they are causing pain, for causing shame, and the market value of the injury. So total there are 5 payments potentially that the victim receives. Now, we have a very moral law about treating your non-Jewish slaves properly. Verse 20, if a man shall strike his non-Jewish slave or his non-Jewish maidservant with the rod, and he shall die under his hand, he shall surely be avenged. And our sages say that means death penalty with decapitation. Imagine, a man is beating his slave for not fulfilling his duties, and he's too harsh and he kills him. That man is killed himself. So we see that there is death penalty for killing your own slave. That is very important, because as we see that without these laws, masters would abuse their slaves, and they would injure them, and they would even kill them. Now we're on page 423. Some more laws of bodily injury. Verse 22, if man shall fight and they collide with a pregnant woman and she miscarries. So if there is no fatality, if the woman doesn't die, only she miscarries, then he shall pay by the order of judges. Which means we evaluate what is the market value of losing a pregnancy, and the one that struck her must pay. However, if there shall be a fatality, if the woman will die, then you shall award a life for a life. Now in verse 24, the Torah tells us an interesting idea. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot, a burn for a burn, a wound for a wound, a bruise for a bruise. From here, our sages tell us that this does not mean that you have to knock out the eye of the attacker, just like he knocked out the eye of the victim. And similarly, you don't have to knock out his tooth, or cut off his hand, or a foot, or give him a burn, or wound him, or bruise him. That's not what it means. What it means is you have to give the monetary value of an eye for an eye. You have to give the monetary value of a tooth for a tooth, and so on. We evaluate the damage financially, and the money goes to the victim. And that makes sense for 2 reasons. Number one, if we injure the attacker, what is the victim going to get from it? Now, he doesn't have an eye, and now the attacker doesn't have an eye. Now both of them don't have an eye. And he doesn't have an eye, and he doesn't have any compensation. Rather, we force the attacker to pay. This way, the attacker feels the pain of having to lose money, and the victim gets money for the pain that he suffered, for the loss of income, for the monetary value of his limb, for the shame, and so on. And